So, in my previous video about the future of fantasy TV, I mentioned that my favorite book series of all time was the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, and I got one or two comments that were just like, wait, you actually like that garbage? So I wanted to vindicate myself just a little by making a video explaining why I love the Dark Tower series so much. First of all, for people who haven't read or heard of the series, I should probably explain what the Dark Tower is about. Basically, you see, okay, so imagine that you took all of literature and pop culture and you crammed it into one series, and it was written by this guy, so there's this dude, Roland, and he's a gunslinger, which in his world is basically the equivalent of being a knight. But the thing is, his reality, Midworld, is collapsing because the Dark Tower, which is a sort of nexus between everything in the multiverse, is under attack. And Roland has to team up with a group of people from different time periods in our world in order to save it. But also, he's sort of obsessed with the tower in this very unhealthy way. And there's this other guy, the Man in Black, who's kind of the amalgamation of a bunch of Stephen King's villains, and he serves the Crimson King, the ultimate bad guy of the story. Now, if none of that sounded like it made any sense, that's okay. The Dark Tower isn't like other epic fantasy works, with their emphasis on intricate world-building architecture. The world-building in the Dark Tower is actually very complex and subtle, particularly in the use of recurring vernacular and cultural concepts that are specific to Roland's world. However, there's also a lot of stuff that just kind of happens, without being fully explained, like the characters being attacked by a giant bear named Shardik with a satellite dish coming out of his head. One of my favorite books about writing is Stephen King's On Writing, and in it, he talks about his style of plotting. Basically, he doesn't. In his words, plot is the writer's jackhammer. You can liberate a fossil from the ground with a jackhammer, no argument there, but you know as well as I do that the jackhammer is going to break as much as it liberates. It's clumsy, mechanical, anti-creative. Plot is, I think, the good writer's last resort and the dullard's first choice. Basically, Stephen King prefers to write off the cuff, going into stories without much of a plan and figuring things out as he goes, using subsequent drafts to fine-tune and impose structure. In the words of his high school newspaper editor, when you write a story, you're telling yourself the story. When you rewrite, your main job is taking out all the things that are not the story. The result of this is that a lot of King's tales revolve more around situations than real plots. His stories evolve naturally as the characters are forced to make decisions and react to their circumstances. Now, a result of this is that Stephen King's stories have a tendency to get a bit weird, which some have also attributed to periods of substance abuse in the author's life. Personally, I don't think that King's approach is suited to every project. In film school, we were taught that screenplays should be well-oiled machines, with the limited runtime of feature films requiring extreme storytelling efficiency to maintain audience-friendly pacing. According to my film instructor's advice, 60% of your time writing a screenplay should be spent planning, 30% outlining, and 10% actually writing, which comes last. I think King's approach is better suited to novels, where there's more leeway to get a bit winding and flow of consciousness with your prose. Of course, there are authors who would swear by their outlines and intricate planning, especially when it comes to fantasy, which often requires intense front-loading of creative labor, taking the time to craft fictional worlds and languages and magic systems all in advance. What I will say of King's approach is that I think it is the best way to get yourself to actually write. Some of the best stories I've ever written were the result of following King's advice, of forcing myself to meet a certain word count per day, regardless of the quality of my output. It also makes writing more fun, as not knowing what's going to happen next in your story turns you into your own audience member, allowing you to be wowed by your improvised brilliance as characters solve problems in ways you never would have expected. At the very least, King's approach certainly explains the volume of his output. But what happens when a writer who doesn't write plot writes a 7-book epic fantasy series over the course of 20 years? Well, The Dark Tower happens. The Dark Tower is more situation-driven than it is plot-driven, and it's very weird. As some of you might be able to tell by my favorite show, Twin Peaks, I have a weakness for dark surrealism executed by auteur weirdos operating at the height of their powers. Now, I don't think that compelling surrealist imagery on its own makes a great story, but what it can do is effectively portray abstract, subconscious feelings and emotions. I grew up watching Studio Ghibli movies, and what I think is so great about those films is that even when you don't know exactly what you're looking at on screen, you know how you're supposed to feel. Surrealism recaptures the childhood experience of not really understanding the world around you on any physical level, but rather experiencing it through the lens of primordial emotions that are more complicated than simple anger, sadness, disgust, etc. Emotions that there aren't really words for, and therefore are most effectively expressed through imagery. I've always thought it's significant that many creators have admitted that the ideas for some of their greatest stories initially came from dreams, these kind of amorphous conglomerations of our most raw emotional truths. Like, one of the farthest things back I can remember is this one image from a dream that I had as a kid. It's 4 chimpanzees in a cave, and I don't know how I know, but the chimpanzees represent my family. Me, my mom, my sister, and my brother. And my dad is outside the cave, and he's evil. Like, not in real life. My dad's great, but in the dream he's evil. And I'm holding this bionicle sword, defending the rest of my family. This image is possibly my earliest memory as a human being. And it's nonsense, right? It looks like something an AI would spit out, which that is partially how I made it. But there's also, symbolism. The toy sword, the primitive family unit, the unfounded Oedipal fear of a parental figure turning on you. It represents an unconscious part of my childhood psyche, filtered through my mind as an assortment of seemingly incongruous iconography. The Dark Tower is the same way, with the series as a whole being a sort of odyssey through what I would call the subconscious of fiction literature, hazily drifting between genres such as fantasy, sci-fi, western, and horror, while also reflecting its own author and his innermost struggles and demons. People have said that The Dark Tower is a story about storytelling, and I partially agree. A particular storytelling technique King uses a lot in The Dark Tower, especially in the later books, is embedded narratives, or nested stories. Basically, a character within the fictional world of the story will start telling a story in extreme detail, and then sometimes a character in that story will then start to tell their own story, creating a Russian doll effect that I can only describe as hypnotic. Like you're being subducted deeper and deeper into the layers of the fictional world, like passing between dreams in some deep slumber. In addition, Stephen King sprinkles in many literary references to cultural staples such as The Wizard of Oz, Harry Potter, and countless of his own stories. Many people who recommend The Dark Tower often paint it as a sort of King Easter egg hunt, and it's true that it is very interwoven with the rest of his body of work, with characters and concepts crossing over from books like The Stand, Salem's Lot, and Eyes of the Dragon. Now, personally, I have not read all of these books, although I know generally what happens in most of them. My hot take is that you don't need to read them to get into The Dark Tower, at least not on a first go-through. One thing I would suggest to first-time readers is giving the series at least until the second book. It's not that the first book is bad, in my opinion. It's a very poetic character study that sets the groundwork for the rest of the series, but it can be alienating to first-time readers, as it is very focused on the main character Roland, who is not always depicted as the most sympathetic protagonist. The second book, The Drawing of the Three, is when the greater part of the main cast is introduced, and when the story really begins to take shape. I think for many, the main party, known in the series as Roland's Quartet, is really the biggest draw of the series, with each character bringing their own unique flavor and emotional baggage to the group. But why is this my favorite book series? I've read a lot of great fiction, particularly fantasy, and I can't really say that The Dark Tower is exceptionally distinguished. It doesn't have the world building of Tolkien, or the myriad of three-dimensional characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. As I already expressed, I often relate my love of The Dark Tower to my love of Twin Peaks, of Studio Ghibli. It's not that these are better stories than their competition, it's more that they just kind of hit different, maybe for me in particular. At the end of the day, we all have unique brain chemistry, and different mental and spiritual itches that need scratching. But for me, These stories possess a kind of mesmeric, spellbinding quality. I don't reread or rewatch a lot of things, often because I find them less compelling the second time around, knowing all of the twists and turns the story is going to take. I tend to obsess over things that I like on a first go-through, wanting to know every detail about the world and the characters, and a consequence of this is that there isn't always a lot there for me the second time around. But I will die. I will go to my grave, never fully understanding this shit. And I like that. I like stories that don't really end, so to speak. That feeling of not knowing, of being lost in the dark. It's like a drug. And, speaking of drugs, I said earlier that people have called The Dark Tower a story about stories, and I think that is about half true. If I were to give my personal interpretation of The Dark Tower, I would say that it's a story about addiction, from a man who, perhaps, understands the cost a little better than most. The Dark Tower explores the cycle of addiction, but in a very mature way, where it's not like, addiction is bad, don't get addicted to stuff. Instead, King seems to say, no, addiction is life. We're all addicted to something. We're all chasing some high, some dream or object, and we believe that if we could just possess this thing, we would finally be happy. Everybody keeps a dark tower in their heart that they want to find. They know it's destructive, and it will probably mean the end of them, but there's that urge to make it your own or destroy it, one or the other.